Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is John Giordano. I'm a partner here at Citrin Cooperman, where I co-lead our firm's manufacturing and distribution practice, along with my colleague Mark Henry. I'm primarily out of our Melville office, and Mark sits in Braintree, Massachusetts. For those of you that don't know us, at Citrin Cooperman here, our goal is to bring value-added solutions to clients through not only our core services and core competencies, such as tax compliance and financial statement assurance work, but also through our advisory practices throughout the firm, whether it be state, local, international tax, strategic planning, digital services and cyber, valuation, due diligence, and quality of earnings studies, or business process outsourcing. Our advisory practice has been built out to give the middle market business owners access to services that a lot of their larger competitors take for granted. We also work closely with subject matter experts on operational needs of our clients, which is going to be exhibited here today. As a follow-up to our webinar we had in March on tariffs, we welcome back Tom Cook, CEO and Managing Director of Blue Tiger International, as we do a deeper dive into strategies of nearshoring and reshoring, exploring the potential benefits and some key insights. Although the current tariff landscape continues to take shape with the recent deferrals and negotiations on new trade agreements, companies are still looking to plan and realign for the future. If nothing else, this recent period of uncertainty has forced business owners to take a closer look at their supply chain and identify areas to reduce risk and spend. As mentioned, we're going to kick it off with Tom Cook today from Blue Tiger. He has over 30 years of experience in assisting companies all over the world manage their import and export operations. Tom is a member of the New York District Export Council, director of the National Institute of World Trade, and sits on board of numerous corporations. Following Tom's presentation today, I'll welcome my colleagues Jory Weissman and Jamie Reichman to join us in a panel discussion on various topics that will be discussed throughout Tom's presentation. So without further ado, I'd like to bring Tom on to start our presentation. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, John, and thank you for the Citrin team to put this webinar together. I just want to make sure, John, the people, if they have questions, they'll be held to the end, right? They'll be just raise their hands and put that in there.
Yeah, so on the question and answer, please feel free to ask them through the chat or through the question and answer throughout. Mark will be monitoring, and anything that we can get done in real time throughout the presentation or the panel, we will. If not, we will have a question and answer available towards the end of our panel discussion today. So it's really up to the participants. If they want to interject throughout, please do so through the Q&A window. And we'll monitor those, and if there's something that we can get to in real time, we certainly will. If not, we will have that window open at the end. So thank you, Tom, for clarifying that.
No problem. Thank you. Next slide, please. So we start off this conversation about the concept of bringing back manufacturing to the United States, or nearshoring, or alternative sourcing, by the conversation of the whole concept of sourcing globally. Through the late 1980s and the 1990s and 2000s, we spent a lot of time in moving a lot of companies who were manufacturing in the United States to various places around the world, and one of the principal countries was China. And since Trump became president in his first term, that whole concept has changed dramatically, where a number of companies obviously have made a decision to decouple or reduce their dependence on China. When we look at the general question of sourcing globally, the first thing we have to recognize is that we have to. There's a significant amount of products that American consumers consume, that American industries utilize, and that all the service organizations have requirements for their functioning. And they just don't exist here in the United States. The estimate is that more than half of what we need in this country really is required to source globally, because that's where the vast majority of those products and or services lie. Another aspect is cost. Is obviously, when we look at the world, some of the highest labor costs are here in the United States. We also have various restrictions relative to OSHA and environmental concerns, and all these things make the cost of manufacturing more expensive here in the United States than other places around the world. A lot of companies through the 1990s made a decision to diversify their sourcing portfolio and not have their entire risk dependent on the United States. So they moved a certain amount of their manufacturing overseas, which was a risk management concept. And lastly, supply chain risk management not only caused the event of sourcing globally, but now in its reverse, it's causing companies to rethink, particularly those that have become totally dependent on China, to actually diversify their sourcing portfolio and move it to an array of other countries. Next slide, please. We also have to take a look at the COVID impact, the issues with China, and landed cost management. The COVID impact relates to the fact that through COVID, a number of companies realized the dependence on China became problematic because not only did the price of goods go up dramatically, but the supply chains caused significant disruptions in terms of the quantity they could get and how the speed of its delivery into the United States. So the vulnerabilities established in the supply chain clearly became more significant through COVID. And that impact is in our minds and our thoughts today as we try to navigate the new challenges through the Trump tariffs. The issues with China we'll take a look at in a more detailed slide in a moment, but there are significant issues with China, and the concept of decoupling and or certainly reducing dependence on China has significant validity when you look at the concept of supply chain risk management. And lastly, I'm going to introduce the whole concept of landed cost management, is that when we think about sourcing outside of the United States or here closer to or in the United States, we have to take apart the 5 silos of transportation, the process of importing, and all the costs associated with 5 different silos as we move goods from overseas into the United States. Next slide, please. So near sourcing is the concept of bringing manufacturing either back to the United States, okay, or closer to the United States, such as Mexico or Canada, some of the countries in Latin America, Caribbean, and so forth. Friendshoring is bringing it to allied countries such as Taiwan, Malaysia, Turkey, South Korea, or Vietnam. So the concept of near sourcing has the concept, first of all, reshoring, which is bringing it back to the United States, okay? The nearshoring, which is bringing closer to the marketplace. And friendshoring is using countries that we're more aligned with or have what we refer to as a more friendly relationship. Next slide, please. So we look at the differences between near sourcing, friendshoring, and reshoring. We also have to think about this from a political perspective, because the vulnerabilities that were identified in COVID still ring within our Senate and our Congress and also the executive office, and particularly with Trump, meaning those vulnerabilities. So there's a lot of conversation going on, not only from a commercial standpoint of companies diversifying their sourcing portfolio and certainly reducing their dependence on China, but there's also discussions now that there should be political mandates, legislation, and political pressure being considered and utilized. Conversation is happening in Congress as we speak. I've testified on this subject matter because they want to identify key and vulnerable areas such as medicines, pharmaceutical products, medical products, precious metals, things related to our energy needs, our aviation needs, our automobile industry. And really, those are the industries that they're looking to more reshore or nearshore closer to home because of the vulnerabilities established with that. And if it doesn't happen from a commercial standpoint, Congress is getting prepared and ready to mandate it through various legislation, meaning that a certain percentage of face masks have to be manufactured outside of China. A certain amount of medical products and pharmaceutical products have to be manufactured back here in the United States. Those type of legislative discussions are going on as we speak. Nothing has solidified. It's still at the discussion stage. Next slide. So when we think about near sourcing, which is bringing it closer to home, the first benefit is you minimize the impact of delays, okay? The increases in cost and the uncertainty. It's a more sustainable model, and particularly companies that have brought back manufacturing closer to home to Mexico. I'm going to talk to you about the Maquiladora program in a little bit. Better management of safety stock. Okay, that's a big issue with anybody in supply chain. How much should we buy? How much should we store? Prior to the COVID impact, companies were in the 6 to 10% of safety stock. They felt very comfortable in doing that. Through COVID, companies felt their vulnerability and raised their management of safety stock to levels of 100 to 150%. Now we're seeing a situation where companies are even going as high as 200% in safety stock, and sometimes keeping a whole year's worth of safety stock. And those who purchased prior to the Trump tariffs are in a very solid position because of that decision. Potentially shorter supply lines. If you moving manufacturing as an example to Mexico, you could move freight in 2 or 3 days from Mexico into the United States. Okay, where as soon as you order from China, you're talking about maybe a 3 or 4 month lead time. But in terms of transportation, the shortest time is somewhere between 28 and 35 days. So you have a much shorter supply chain and much less expensive as well. And you have ease of control. It's much easier to fly down to Tijuana or Valdez or Matamoros to deal with a Mexican manufacturing as an example than it is to try to book a flight to China. And generally, when we go to Mexico, we can spend 2 or 3 days and come back. Generally, when we go to China, we're there for a week or 2 weeks, maybe even as much as 3 weeks, and it's a very expensive trip. Next slide, please. The challenge of near sourcing is that change is always difficult. We get comfortable with suppliers. One of the things that we always find, particularly in looking at alternative sourcing from companies that are based in China, they have a relationship that's been there for 10 years. It's successful. It's at a low cost. They meet most of the requirements that they need, and it's a good quality product. So making a change always becomes difficult. Finding pseudo suppliers in other markets is a challenge all by itself, not a challenge that cannot be met, but certainly one that requires amount of time and initiative. You have to create financial justification when making that move to an alternative supply source. And lastly, you have to evaluate the risk management benefit, meaning that sometimes there might be a higher cost in alternative sourcing, but it lowers the risk in your supply chain. Next slide, please. We've gone through a process that's taken 30 years to evolve of how we come about making the decisions on how we turn around and source our products internationally. We do an assessment of the supply chain needs. We create certain recommendations from that assessment and create a financial model on what the options would be. We always try to create an ROI. We then move to operational model. What does purchasing and sales and customer service have to do differently when we move sourcing to this particular country in the world or back here into the United States? And lastly is implementation, which are the steps just to make it happen. Next slide, please. So I mentioned before the 5 silos. These are the 5 silos that we dissect in that assessment process to come up with the recommendations of what opportunities exist for you to reduce risk and spend in your supply chain as a near sourcing opportunity. We look at the acquisition cost. That's a negotiation that you have with the supplier. The freight and moving it from point A to point B. The customs clearance process, which has costs attached to it. Duties and taxes, which obviously is the big issue today because in some cases it's driven as much as 170% higher than it was a few months ago. And lastly, most companies bring goods into a warehouse or a manufacturing location to do final assembly or final manufacturing. Then there's the inland freight, warehousing, fulfillment, and distribution, what we refer to as the last mile delivery. Next slide, please. So things that we think about when we dissect those 5 areas is that when we look at the duty circumstances where the duty is impacted, the cost might be higher, but the duty is eliminated. As an example, if we source in Mexico, because of the USMCA agreement, we're basically eliminating the duty when the goods move from Mexico into the United States. So the acquisition cost might be higher, but the landed cost is lower. Freight, the cost is higher, but the freight is much less expensive. Again, looking at Mexico as an example, it takes maybe $1,000 to move a tractor trailer from Mexico into the United States against maybe $4,000 to $7,000 to move a 40-foot container from China into the United States. Control, the cost is higher, but typical delays are eliminated. And we have better control over the transportation infrastructure. As we all know, there was a significant pause in purchasing from China when Trump brought up all these tariff concerns and raised it. Obviously, he released that about 2 weeks later. But in that 2 week period, the transportation companies moved a lot of their assets, which they weren't utilizing, to other parts of the world. So now you have China's back on, and companies are trying to bring in a significant amount of product before the reciprocal tariffs hit. Okay. And obviously, transportation costs have risen now in the last 2 or 3 weeks, and they'll continue to rise because you have the issue where the demand is greater than the capacity. Next slide, please. So critics of nearsourcing, costly production changeovers, legitimate issue. Tooling development, legitimate issue. Commodity costs, one of the things that makes China a less expensive market is it has a significant amount of the raw material needs that's required in its manufacturing process. And if it doesn't have it, it's developed tremendous relationships with the countries around the world to bring in the raw materials and supplies that they need. Freight pricing stability is an issue. Political and economic changes that are issue, and appreciate that what Trump is doing has significant political impacts and economic impacts all over the world, which is why it's such a disruptive events that he's doing when he's putting out these various tariffs. And handling lower production volume. One of the things that's great about China is they have a great fluctuation ability to handle both lower volumes and higher volumes, where in other places around the world, when we negotiate, they only want to handle higher volume clients. Lower volumes become a little bit more problematic. Next slide, please. So these two graphs show also some of the challenges, which is the tooling costs. We did a study about 3 years ago on this. We took an example of about 20 companies, and we looked at the tooling costs in China, which averaged about $28,000 as compared to over $100,000 here in the United States. Another example on the slide to the right is looking at the lead time required. In China, it was about a 7-week to 8-week lead time. Here in the United States, it required as much as 14 weeks. The only comment I would say that the United States, that's when you bring it over in the initial stages. Once things come up and running, it levels out to the same time frame that we see in China. Next slide, please. Having said that, in the last 4.5 years, we have successfully moved 37 of 44 attempts to near sourcing options, which have been successful. The biggest challenges were finding, one, a viable source alternative, 2, establishing a financial justification model. In some cases, the model does present a higher cost, but again, when we bring up that higher cost, the risk management benefit lowers the risk. And the tooling operating costs and the local requirements also become challenging depending upon where in the world we're at. Next slide, please. With China, there are specific issues that we need to be concerned with. Intellectual property rights are not protected in China. The stance that China has with the United States and the West, and the stance in reverse that we have with China. There are issues with Taiwan and the South China Seas. Forced labor issues. I just had a case just the other day again where goods were seized in Port Elizabeth in New York over forced labor issues, where customs suspected that product came from an area in China where forced labor has a predominance. The relationship of China with North Korea, Russia, Africa, and Iran. Continuation of problems with COVID internally in China. And lastly, their requirement for forced information transfers, which creates significant IPR exposures for a lot of US companies and companies in the West. Next slide, please. So when we think about China, we make the point not to eliminate them, but really reduce our dependency. They really are a great manufacturing resource. They produce generally a very high quality product at a very low cost. They're able to tool up quickly. Okay, they have great resources, okay, raw materials and components, which makes them a very viable market. So we don't want to eliminate them. We want to reduce the dependency. Take a risk management approach to create options and diversify in your portfolio, not to move it to just another country, but maybe spreading it out to 2 or 3 countries. Test the options. They're likely to produce results. You don't have to commit a huge volume initially. You can commit a smaller volume, test it, make it work, tweak it, and then use it as a sustainable option. Next slide, please. In the whole subject of tariff mitigation, we work with Citrin and a lot of their clients on 20 solutions, okay? Foreign trade zones, bonded warehouses, tariff engineering, drawback, freight consolidation, demand planning, intensive operations, training, and resources such as the webinar that reaches out like this, direct shipping programs, alternative and near sourcing, which is the topic today, the choice of the Incoterm, utilization of technology, free trade agreements, warehousing, distribution, comprehensive landed cost modeling, taking those 5 silos and dissecting them, robust supply chain assessments, bringing in guidance and expertise. That's one of the strong points that Citrin has for their clients, is bringing in not only their internal talent, but where they have strategic relationships. Trade compliance management, adhering to all import and export regulations. The first sale option, HTS alterations and line item reviews, and the last, the choice of bringing in parts versus finished product and doing an assembly operation here in the United States are all various options that are available. Next slide, please. Here's an example of how we put together a financial model. This one is a comparison where we took a Florida-based company that had about $90 million of computer peripheral sales, and we moved them into Mexico. But before we moved them in, we did an analysis of the cost. And this is an actual case study that was done several years ago. And if you can see, we've taken the 5 silos and line item in the white area of that diagram and put out the extended costs. At the end of the day, per transaction, they're saving $19,000 by moving the goods being manufactured in China now to Mexico. This is where the acquisition cost is on par. This company has 2 imports weekly, okay, which gives them total savings of over $2 million on an annual basis. So creating the financial model like this is very important in terms of making a more informed, better decision. Next slide, please. The Maquiladora program in Mexico is a program, it's actually an immigration policy to help keep more Mexicans in Mexico because there are high-paying blue-collar jobs now available, more than 1 million of them that have been created since the mid-1990s. It allows for manufacturing, assembly, and distribution inside Mexico along a 50-mile swath of land, okay? Under the USMCA agreement, it's elimination of duty and tax benefits. It lowers the landed cost dramatically, and it's both a resource for friend and nearshoring program. And about 60% of the Fortune 1000 companies in America have a direct or an indirect interest in the Maquiladora program. It's that important and that successful. Next slide, please. We also have free trade agreements with numerous countries, such as the ones that are listed here, meaning that the trade that we have with these countries will be at a 0 rate, okay? All these countries have come to the table to negotiate with Trump to make sure that that free trade agreement stays in place, okay? We've already seen his position with Mexico and Canada, which are 2 of our largest trading partners, where that policy is now being protected. Next slide, please. Free trade agreements give us ease of import and export. They eliminate the duties, and they create very much so lower landed costs. Next slide, please. Foreign trade zones is another option that's worth talking about because it allows us to bring back manufacturing and assembly to the United States and to do it much more competitively because, one, we're deferring the duties and the taxes. There's a tariff inversion benefit because we bring in materials at a certain HTS number, but we change it into a finished product that's a different HTS number, which causes a lower duty rate. Allows for weekly transactions, so we lower our customs clearance costs, okay? Anything that's exported from the facility, no duties are applied at all because the goods would never have entered the United States. We reduce the merchandise processing fees that customs charges, and depending upon where we're located, there are potential tax benefits in local communities in the various cities, states, counties, and so forth all across the country. Next slide, please. Other option to foreign trade zone is bonded warehouses, but when bonded warehouses is really just set up for storage and distribution, no product manipulation. Next slide, please. Foreign trade zones allow manufacturing, assembly, fulfillment, and distribution, deferral of duties, elimination of duties, tariff inversion, and reduced overall customs clearance costs. There's hundreds of thousands of dollars and millions of dollars of savings depending upon the size of your supply chain. Next slide. The case study, this one is a company up in Detroit that services the automobile industry. They're a tier 2 auto supplier. We switched their facility to a foreign trade zone. It took about 90 days from beginning to end to make that happen. So they now imported parts and components and did the final assembly in the back of their facility. The annual savings turned out to be about $3.5 million against approximately $125,000 of additional cost in setting up that assembly capability. Next slide, please. So we're making informed decisions, okay, and that's part of the process that we go through in the assessment to figure which ones of these things will work best for us. Next slide, please. We also recommend highly that any company involved in importing and exporting enter the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism program. It's voluntary. It elevates your compliance profile with customs, okay, and affords easier access to any of the government programs. And you also get out of jail free card, meaning that you already mitigated any potentially a problem that you have with customs when you obtain that status. Very important. Next slide, please. Supply chain risk management, this concept of this whole near sourcing concept. It's considering this concept as a risk management strategy. China should be a serious concern for all those risks that we put in there. Not, again, the purpose of eliminating, but to reduce dependency. Foreign trade zones are really a very significant, viable option for bringing back not only distribution, but manufacturing and assembly here in the United States. And there are third-party assessments that provide significant value when you have somebody who can benchmark and bring in external expertise to the table. Next slide, please. So with that, I'm going to transfer it back to Mr. Giordano, and I believe that we're going to open it up to a panel discussion.
Thanks, Tom. Mr. Giordano throws me off a little bit. I turn around and start looking for my father, but I appreciate it. Appreciate all the insights and glad everybody's still with us to go through this panel discussion, which will center around a lot of the topics that Tom introduced during his presentation today. So joining us here is one of my partners, Jory Weissman, out of our New York City office. He's an experienced professional with over 25 years in the technology industry, consulting, designing, selling, supporting, and implementing solutions across a variety of technological platforms and applications. Jory's practical industry experience has given him an insider's perspective into thousands of businesses, including manufacturers, distributors in the industrial, food and beverage, and CPG sectors, financial service firms, and countless other niche practices throughout his career. Jory has been named the top ERP sales professional for over 4 years in a row with AccountMate Corporation and is a Microsoft, Acumatica, NetSuite certified sales professional. Also joining Jory and Tom will be Jamie Reichart. Jamie is from our state and local tax partner in our national tax office. In his role, he provides consulting advice to all different types of businesses on income tax, sales tax, gross receipts tax, property tax, realty transfer, but most importantly, credits and incentives, which will be the tie-in for today. Jamie helps companies not only identify potential compliance issues and tax reporting exposures, but also assists with identifying and securing proactive refunds, tax credits or abatements, and other incentive opportunities. He's been able to secure several millions of dollars in tax savings and economic development benefits throughout his career. So welcome, everyone.
Well, thank you.
Appreciate it, everyone's time today. I am going to start off the conversation by tying back to Tom and one of the things he mentioned, because he mentioned it a couple times in his presentation, and I think it's important to kind of walk through this in a little bit more detail. You mentioned not fully divesting, but reducing dependency on China and seeking alternatives. But I think one of the questions that I think would probably be in a lot of people's minds is, how do you obtain the lower pricing that China has to offer? Throughout the process, do you see that automation and robotics will help offset the higher labor costs, or how do you think that would be resolved, or tackled by many people looking to divest from China?
Yeah, a few questions in that.
Yeah, it's fully loaded. I fully loaded that
uh,
one.
So the concept of, first of all, I think China is an important manufacturing capability and has significant prowess. And that we shouldn't look to totally divest, because I think it's important because it produces a quality product at a very low price. So the key words is reduce dependence, not necessarily eliminate. Okay. The second aspect is that one of the problems that we have in the United States in reshoring manufacturing here is we do not have a strong blue collar skilled labor force to fill those jobs. We have a problem sometimes when we bring back manufacturing to the United States. We can build a foreign trade zone model, but it does still require people. So you mentioned robotics. Robotics is a significant answer. It happens to be one of the reasons why China is successful. China has about 36% of its manufacturing in a robotic state, where the United States only has about 16% of its manufacturing in a robotic state. So we have a lot more to do. And that's going to be a solution as companies want to bring back manufacturing. The foreign trade zone model makes that work successfully, but you still need people to work within that facility. And robotics provides a better answer because it takes away from the need to actually have a higher amount of labor force.
Yeah. And switching to jury quickly, because I think it's going to tie in a little bit to the reshoring here. We've all learned that there are a couple of different options that a company may have. And we see at least one of the quickest and most cost-efficient ways could be to implement a 3PL, a third-party logistics company to work with. So from a technology perspective, what would you say would be some of the top-level decisions management should consider if they decide to use a 3PL provider to bring operations closer to shore here in the States?
Yeah, I think there are obviously a number of things they have to think about. First and foremost, I always think about functionality first, and how different is the operating model in the future state compared to the legacy state. And they can evaluate as part of that, are the supply chain processes changing? For instance, if you're transitioning from a buy-based program where you have finished goods, and as Tom pointed out, managing landed costs, and already using a 3PL, but now you need to take on manufacturing or a different assembly or an outsourced production process, you may need to ensure your internal systems are supporting a bill of materials capability and basic manufacturing. Even if you're just bringing in raw materials and using outsourced production, managing that's important. And then is your 3PL capable of being able to support that functionality as well? You may have a perfectly good relationship with someone who could do outstanding job pick and pack, but potentially assembly, other manufacturing processes, not so much. So that's going to be important. And also, when you're dealing with many more transactions, right, instead of just bringing in finished goods and turning it around, we now have the multiplier effect of some commodity imports of raw materials and things of that nature, or even domestic sourcing. The requirement to transact electronically with the 3PL is important. So the other things you want to think about is, what is their integration capabilities and connectivity type? They're going to be working with a true EDI format, and maybe you're going to take them from a straight fulfillment process doing things like an EDI 940 or 945, and start to get into more receiving transaction processing and inventory management transaction processes. So those become very important consideration. There's a myriad of other things you want to think about relative to data ownership and security and things like that. But those 2 or 3 points will certainly be enough to, start to consider early in the process as you think about 3PL impact.
Great. Yeah, Jamie, I do have a question for you, but I do want to stay with Jory for 1 second. So we talked about a 3PL. Now, what if I were to flip that and say, what should you consider then if you're looking to build out your own company-owned and managed facility here? How would that differ from the 3PL model from a technology perspective?
Well, I think there are a lot of
things the
things.
same, do things differently. What
Yeah.
other things would you layer into that?
Well, I think there, yeah, obviously core considerations will remain the same, functionality, business process, things of that nature. I think you need to evaluate that in the context of these entirely new operating procedures. And, certainly Tom's commentary on the skilled labor force and other things notwithstanding, I think functionality, you have to think about your system's readiness to support. But I think beyond that, when you're building your own infrastructure, and I have one of our clients is going through that right now, just built an amazing facility in upstate New York, and seeing the challenges they went through, things like just making sure you have internet connectivity and redundancy and the length of time it takes to do that kind of planning. People kind of think about the building and infrastructure first and tend to think about IT infrastructure second, or something that can be done very, very quickly. I would suggest you want to really maintain a parallel track because they can both take an extended period of time. Wi-Fi connectivity and the whole new realm of tablet-based inputs on the shop floor control. How do you make the processes more efficient with labor? In a smaller labor pool, you have to be able to do things way more efficiently. So those are substantive considerations from internet connectivity, Wi-Fi infrastructure, security, shop floor control. Those are just a few of the areas that you want to think about. And then finally, as you think about future state, you're going to have to remain competitive. You're making a capital investment for the next 15, 20, 25 years, right? You want to be able to maintain agility and competitiveness going forward. So maybe you can transition your current systems today, but are they really going to be positioned to take advantage of AI or other modern production or manufacturing capabilities, that if they're not laying the groundwork today, pivoting to that could be really challenging. So cautionary note there if you're going to build, some similar concerns, but I think start early would be the advice as you're planning the construction of the building, plan out these other things.
That makes sense. So again, two different options, two similar but distinct strategies in achieving them. So appreciate your background on that. So Jamie, like I said, I wanted to come back to you as your background in state and local tax, talking about, potentially expanding robotics here, IT investments, expanding a labor force, et cetera, et cetera. What are some of the state and local tax implications for companies seeking to establish a new production, processing, or even distribution facility here in the States?
Yeah, sure, John. Believe it or not, as we mentioned a lot of times in the SALT world, the rules obviously deviate by tax type, jurisdiction, even legal entity, even particular industry. But a few common themes that come to mind from the state and local tax world when it comes to establishing any kind of new operation in the US. One, from the perspective of tax compliance and tax payment, obviously establishing an operation in the US is going to now create what we call nexus in that jurisdiction. So that company now is going to have to file, whether it's the state imposes a net income tax, a franchise tax, a gross receipts tax, as well as considering sales and use tax, right? If they're making taxable retail sales, collecting sales tax on those sales now in the state, or alternatively collecting exemption certificates, right? If they're making sales to other resellers, wholesalers, distributors, and sort of all the compliance that comes along with that. The other common theme that comes up is potential credits and incentives, which I think we're going to get into in a little more detail later in terms of specific types. But anytime you're looking at any kind of operation moving to the United States in a particular, any jurisdiction, that involves increased payroll as well as investment, you're most likely going to have an incentive opportunity, whether that incentive takes the form of a tax credit, a grant, a different type of sales tax exemption, property tax abatement. We'll go into in more detail. There likely is a potential benefit that's on the table. Another major cost that often kind of gets forgotten about in the SALT world is property taxes, right? Even if we don't own the property itself, the business, and we're just leasing the facility, right? More often than not, the lease costs are going to bake in the real estate tax costs into that total lease component. as well as personal property taxes, right? So personal property taxes imposed on, the manufacturing equipment, production equipment and machinery, different processing equipment, things like that. So those are some of the things that come up in the property tax world. And 14 states actually don't impose personal property taxes. So those are, maybe some of the jurisdictions we look at when thinking about if we have heavy capital spends of these particular taxable items, maybe those are jurisdictions we're looking at. And then the other final point I'll mention is just the effect on the tax base, right? We talked about how a company might be subject now to income tax, a franchise tax, maybe based on net worth, or a gross receipts tax that's imposed on the company's gross receipts. All of those taxes get apportioned, which in simple terms means it gets divided up between the states based on the level of activity that's conducted in those states. And each state has a different apportionment formula. Some only look to sales, some look to property and payroll and sales. So increasing your property, increasing your payroll, right, could potentially increase the taxable income by virtue of the apportionment percentage. So there are ways that we can help mitigate and plan for that when we know that a facility is going to be coming on site in a new state.
Yeah, so I know, Tom mentioned doing his financial analysis from a operational perspective, but I know Jamie, you and I have worked on financial analysis from a tax perspective for companies looking to come over. So there's different layers of analysis that have to tie in to really evaluate the entire process, even going back to, the investment that you may need to make on the IT side with digital services such that Jory talked through. So I want to circle back to Tom, because we talked about a 3PL. We talked about, potentially starting your own facility here, pros and cons on both. But I want to do a deeper dive into the foreign trade zones. Tom, you and I have worked on these a couple times for various different clients, and I know this is a world that you play in a lot. So I think it's worth continuing that discussion. And I think one of the biggest misconceptions out there, maybe you could touch on in your response, is I think helping people to understand that having a foreign trade zone, you don't necessarily need to acquire a new production facility or anything like that you could probably just reclassify your own facility. So maybe you could just walk us through the process of a foreign trade zone, continue to expand on the benefits and how you can go through the compliance in that. When we talk about the compliance of a foreign trade zone, I might ask Jury to just step in case there's any technological benefits that we could apply. Another loaded question for you, Tom. I'm sorry.
Yeah, understood, no problem. So the foreign trade zone, the benefit of it is, and the structure of it is that it's a physical location in the United States, such as a warehouse, a manufacturing location, a distribution point that sits here geographically, but the location, when it achieves the FTZ status, sits outside the US economy. So when goods come through the border into an FTZ, there's no obligation to do a customs clearance, and there's no obligation to pay duties or taxes. And in a foreign trade zone, it's only when it exits that facility is there a time that you're now obligated to pay duties and taxes. And if the goods get exported from the facility, they would export without paying duties and taxes because they would never have entered the US economy. So that's a huge benefit for companies right there just by itself. But if an FTZ is also set up where you're doing assembly work or manufacturing, okay, that now provides another whole level of benefit because you're taking raw materials and components and importing them in. No obligation to do a customs clearance, no obligation to pay duty. They come in at a particular HTS number, and the duty rates of the various components and parts might range from 5 to 7%. But they get now assembled into a finished product with a different HTS number. That's the tariff inversion. You're inverting it from one HTS number to another HTS number. And finished product generally has a lower duty rate than does parts, raw materials, and components. So customs says to you, you can declare the value to them that provides the better benefit to you. So the tariff inversion allows you to now bring it in at a much lower duty rate, and all the cost of the assembly process, labor, overhead, insurance, quality control, any technology input is subtracted from the cost. So you're not only declaring it at a lower duty rate, but you're declaring a lower value because of all the charges you can subtract from that. So for assembly and manufacturing, it really, the FTZ provides benefits on a steroid basis. And as you mentioned, you could have it set up in the back of your facility within your existing structure, or you could do it at a new location, or you could do it through a third-party operator. About a third of our business is dealing directly with third-party companies, 3PLs, freight forwarders, custom house brokers, trucking companies, warehousemen that have that capability. As a matter of fact, we just set up for a company in Los Angeles an 800,000 square foot FTZ facility, and they put out to the world of electronic products that they have skilled labor in that facility to do assembly. And they have clients now. It's only been open for about 2 months. They have clients lined up outside their door coming from South Korea, China, Vietnam, Malaysia, wanting to assemble their computers and their electronic equipment in that facility because of the great economic benefit. It would make their supply chains all work more competitively when this place is up and running. It's all done under a third-party structure.
You did a great job, Tom. You covered about 9 of my 10 questions. I just have one more follow-up quickly. What type of compliance goes into something like that? Like what would a company need to do to remain compliant, not only in achieving the foreign trade zone or FTZ status, but also is there on an ongoing basis, is there anything that they need to do to hold that status?
When you apply for the FTZ, the Foreign Trade Zone Board in Washington and the local customs office has 3 primary silos of responsibility that you have to demonstrate to get to that status. You have to have security at the facility, meaning unfettered access to somebody gaining entry into the facility. So you have to have basic security measures. The second is product accountability, which is developing a technology that tracks the product from its receipt through its work in process and inventory and as it leaves the facility. And lastly is compliance, the specific question you asked. So there are regulations that you have to follow in importing and exporting. You have regulations that you have to follow from a compliance perspective inside a foreign trade zone. And so what we do is we create a procedures manual, we train the people so that they can adhere to those requirements. And in the application process, you have to demonstrate to customs that you can handle those compliance responsibilities, such as example, making sure you're using the right HTS number, you're using the right valuation methodology, that you have a record keeping system that goes back 5 years and can extract anything that's required that customs might need. So principles like that are the things that are in place. And that's the use of an outside company like ourselves, of which there are several, make sure that all the ducks are lined up in order before you go through the process to make sure that you're going to meet all the requirements proactively rather than reactively.
Great, thanks. Jory, I have a question for you, but Mark messaged me directly that he has a follow-up. So Mark, you're on screen. You want to go ahead?
Yeah, Tom, question just came in directly to what you were talking about. So if a company is looking at using a 3PL with a foreign trade zone or developing one internally in their own warehouse, you kind of talked about some of the compliance issues. Does it alleviate any of the compliance using a 3PL? And is there a different risk profile from using a 3PL versus using it internally?
Customs, when it's a 3PL situation, you now have an operator and a user, right? The operator is the 3PL, the user is the company that's the importer exporter that's receiving the benefit for their work, right? At the end of the day, one or both parties have to maintain those 3 standards of security, product accountability, and compliance. So if the principal company who's using the third party outsources that to the operator, that's perfectly acceptable, okay, if that's the way the arrangement is made, or the principal company can maintain those responsibilities themselves. Customs just wants to make sure that some party is entering the arrangement knowing that they have the obligation to provide responses to customs with inquiries and that they're doing everything according to regulation. For 3PLs that get into this business, this is actually a source of revenue because they can provide that service and charge for it. So it becomes a value add for them. But one of the things that we say to principal companies is that if you outsource this to an operator, customers will still require you to have in place concepts to supervise and control that activity, which means that you can outsource it, but you're still going to be held responsible to some extent that they're doing everything they're supposed to do.
Yeah. And then from that perspective, thanks, Tom. You know, hearing about the compliance and the tracking and everything needs to be done. Jory, any thoughts on how you could leverage technology to make the process, especially when you're talking about it seems like you have to do a lot of tracking of components and various different aspects of the manufacturing process that seems to have to be tracked, especially when you talk about tariff inversion. Any thoughts on from a technology perspective?
Yeah, I think all of this has an impact, and I think the principal company, as Tom referred to them as, has an obligation and a necessity to really effectively manage those costs and have real stringent cost layering. I've worked with organizations with bonded warehouse facilities and such, and managing the cost, maybe having a FIFO management system or a lot-based management system that allows them to track those discrete receipts, because as we see, rates are changing, duty costs are changing, freight costs are changing. So aside from the obligation for customs reporting, managing bottom line, it's incumbent upon these organizations to be able to have the granularity within their tracking to be able to support that. Again, if you're going into manufacturing environment, it just becomes exponential. So you definitely need systems to support that. And typically more sophisticated 3PLs with higher levels of connectivity. And we talked earlier about the different EDI style considerations. You know, obviously incorporation of real-time updates to inventory, getting enhanced visibility into the inventory is also a key thing. These are, to Tom's point, areas of additional revenue generation that a 3PL can provide. But all of those things need to be taken into consideration. But I always revert back down to what is your system's capacity to support the cost management that you need to be able to track.
Yeah, and another thing that we see, and Tom mentioned on it, and with an FTZ, you have the ability to defer duties and taxes if it does re-enter the U.S. economy coming out of the FTZ. But I think a key note to that is even though those duties and taxes need to be paid at some point, oftentimes it could be at a lower rate. But I think also the cash deferral of having that cash flow free up earlier in the process and be closer to the sales cycle of the goods can help a company's working capital. So I know when we go through these, you know, we talk about a lot of modeling. Cash flow modeling ties into it as well to see how establishing this type of facility could even free up cash flow to assist in the operation.
The cash flow is a huge part, John, because today the cost of money is at the 10 to 11% rate, internal rate of return. So if your inventory turn is every 4 months, that's a huge savings that it provides, which is that cash flow benefit. But I just want to mention on the technology side is that when we do the assessment stage, we're assessing a company's existing technology for the ERP and their WMS. And 50% of our foreign trade zone cases, we're able to maintain that system, their existing ERP and WMS, and we just create upgrades to that system, meaning we add additional fields and connectivity. Okay. Of the balance of 50%, half just require bolt-on technologies that just supplement what their weaknesses might be in their ERP or WMS. And the other 25%, there are about 7 companies out there that provide FTZ technology, and that they come in 25% of the time to just provide the solution because they've got the technology already structured that's unique to a company. So the company replaces for its FTZ, its ERP and WMS with a brand new FTZ technology off the shelf.
Yeah. And you know, a lot of the panel discussion that we've had, you know, taking away from it is that there seems to be costs involved, whether it be establishing, you know, the technological environment around this, you know, the labor we talked about several different things, and it's very cost driven, which is the initial investment in setting up the operations either here or nearshoring. So in light of that, Jamie, I know we discussed earlier the tax considerations. Are there any strategies that could be employed by a business to help mitigate some of these costs and compliance to keep non-US businesses out of the state and local tax base?
Yeah, so I would say there's sort of two levels of strategies slash, cost mitigation. One, when we're looking at it from the standpoint of purely trying to keep, we'll call foreign operations outside of the state tax base, right? We have to think about that many states rely on something called combined unitary reporting, which essentially is a simple way of saying that they lump companies together, usually corporations that are engaged in the same type of business and that have common control, common management, common, intercompany services between the entities. But one thing to keep in mind is number one, those rules don't come into play when we're dealing with pass-through entities in general when it comes to state tax. So if the entity is organized, for instance, as a partnership, those rules generally don't come into play and that partnerships are not lumped in together. Number two, even if we are dealing with a corporate structure, right, and where we have several different corporate entities, and there's a risk or fear of maybe they are going to be combined in a particular state, like a New York, a Massachusetts that have, or New Jersey that have combined unitary reporting, there are mechanisms, as well as California is a prime example as well. There are mechanisms in the law which allow for what's called making a water's edge election. And all that means is it limits the entities included on this joint return to the entities that maintain more than 20% of their property or payroll or revenue in the United States. And so if you fall below those percentages, the foreign entity can be excluded from the unitary reporting group. Another strategy that's often employed is for both federal as well as state tax purposes is blocker entities, right? Often, maybe operations in the US will be structured as a partnership, and then you'll have a corporation as the owner, right? Kind of blocking the United States state activity and keeping the foreign activity out. Or you can just, like I said, have corporate entities, non-partnerships that are, again, blocking each's activities from being subject to tax, as long as the appropriate water's edge election is being made to only subject the United States companies to tax. Or you're dealing in a state, we select a state for operation that doesn't have combined reporting. So they only look at the entity by entity approach, so they wouldn't suck in the foreign operations. And then sort of the second component of what I'll mention is you didn't directly ask about, but I think kind of related to the cost discussion, are incentives, right? What potential incentives are available at the state and local level to help defray those costs and to help offset some of that initial capital investment in the facility, the equipment, as well as even, people costs. So what are some examples of, some of the incentives that are available? First off is just, it's important to distinguish, we categorize these different incentives into two broad buckets, what we call as of right statutory incentives and what we call discretionary incentives. The as of right statutory incentives are the ones that really don't require any kind of application, but in advance, right? And then just require basically filing a form by the end of the tax year. So many states have what's called like general investment tax credits that don't require permission or approval in advance, but they just require, like I said, filing the applicable state tax form with the income tax return to be able to claim that credit, right? So that's the as of right. The discretionary credits, usually the much more lucrative tax credits or incentives, those are the ones that require, asking the state essentially for permission. And you have to structure the discussion with the state as, there is an interstate competition, right? Because a lot of these state programs are designed to give the incentive to kind of be a material factor in the location decision, or to sort of be the, tipping point for causing the company to choose state A versus state B, with all things being equal. So that the reason why I mentioned that key distinction is just because the factor of timing. If we think we're going into a new jurisdiction and there's significant discretionary incentives on the table, we don't want to execute any leases, we don't want to execute any purchase contracts or letters of intent because the state is going to ask for those types of documents to try to see, was there a prior commitment in the state, or is there really an interstate competition? So I just wanted to mention that because I think it's important when you're thinking about the process involved for getting these incentives. So what are some of the examples? There are tax credits, right, for investment and employment. And those tax credits can be used sometimes by the business entity itself, depending on the entity type. They can also be passed through to the owners if it's, for instance, a partnership. The credits can be refundable in some states, right, where you claim them and then any excess is actually cash paid back to the company or the owners. They can be carried forward off, sometimes they have a 15, 20-year carry forward, depending on the tax type. Or sometimes, and many states have moved in this direction, I would say the predominant majority, where they're allowing for the sale or transfer of the tax credit, right? So you can actually earn the tax credits as a business for employment and investment, and then sell those tax credits to get actual cash up front. Other examples of job creation grants, right, that are usually based on payroll withholdings. There's job training and workforce development grants and tax credits. New York, as a prime example, in their budget bill, just passed a very significant tax credit for manufacturing as well as semiconductor manufacturing. That's giving several thousands of dollars per employee. There's R&D credits, right? Similar to federal, that the research and development credit. States have their own R&D credit that can be refunded or passed through to owners. For property tax purposes, there are what's called pilots, payment in lieu of taxes or abatements, which basically allow for the property owner, instead of paying the full amount of property tax on the increased assessment for the work done and the construction on the facility, it allows for a reduced rate to be paid, usually over a 15 to 25-year period. And then there's other programs like low interest loans, the ability to transfer NOLs for cash is a program that's in a few, NOLs being net operating losses. There are programs that have that, as well as angel investor tax credits and venture funds that states create to actually invest in companies that are locating in the state, sometimes emerging technology companies. And then finally, last thing is that many jurisdictions like a PA, a Maryland, a Texas have what's called like enterprise zones, or what's called keystone opportunity zones, which essentially allow for the abatement of most of the state and local taxes generated in that particular zone to be completely abated or partially abated, again, based on the business operating in the zone and then hiring. And tied to that is, you're probably hearing about it, the federal tax law, as legislation is being considered. There's the Federal Opportunity Zone program. That was a program that was put into law back in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017, which was a popular and heavily subscribed program that allows investors to invest capital gains in investment vehicles that invest in real estate or businesses in distressed census tracts across the United States. And so there is talk that that program will be re-upped at the federal level. And so there's the opportunity, right, where you have the right project to layer in foreign trade zone, maybe federal opportunity zone with these state incentives. So you can kind of triple dip on the potential, state tax incentives, federal incentives for additional savings.
Now, Jamie, you mentioned there, I caught through going through it, you said state A versus state B. So my question for you is more directly, are there any locations or jurisdictions that are better when you're looking at this type of analysis for these types of incentives and financing?
Sure. Yeah, the usual big states when it comes to some of the high dollar programs and the most lucrative, I would say from our experience, are New York, New Jersey, Texas, Tennessee, North Carolina, Maryland, Massachusetts, as well as Georgia. Those states have an array of different programs and across really different industry types that offer very significant, whether it's tax credits or grants. I would say if your focus is more maybe like in the technology / biotech, if that's the space that maybe the company is playing in, particularly like a New Jersey, a Massachusetts, Maryland, New York, Virginia are major jurisdictions in that area, because Virginia actually has a particular capital gain exclusion for emerging technology businesses that operate in the state. So I would say of all the jurisdictions I just named, for really any manufacturing, processing, production activity, there's likely going to be a significant incentive if there's a capital investment that's a couple of $1 million plus, and there's hiring of 10, 15 jobs or more, you're likely going to be looking at a pretty nice incentive opportunity in all those jurisdictions.
Good. Thank you. And Mark, you had a question about, I know you came back on, about applying for manufacturing status. You want to?
Yeah, so Jamie, I'm not sure if this is you or for John, but as a lot of the grants and incentives that you talked about, which are fantastic, are a lot of them are skewed towards manufacturers, right? And there's still some for other businesses as well, but for any distribution companies that we have on this call, how should they be thinking about getting manufacturing status as they think about reshoring?
Well, does the distribution company actually manufacture? I'm sorry, I'm not sure.
Yeah, so today they don't manufacture, just a distribution company. Tomorrow they want to reshore, become eligible for all these grants, start manufacturing in the United States. And John, I'm not sure if I know you've done this process before. What is the process going through their state to become a manufacturer, eligible manufacturer, or with the federal government?
Well, I think that, maybe when you maybe want to create a new entity, but I mean, there's really not a registration or sort of qualification at the state level. It's more if you hit particular criteria based on your activities and the industry that you're in, you'll sort of avail yourself of these programs. Maybe, John, there's another sort of additional federal component that I'm not thinking of.
Yeah, I just know that a lot of it, a lot of the incentives that we've looked at over the years, it ties back into your federal NAICS code. So it would need to consult with your tax provider in terms of changing that NAICS code on the return. Or another avenue could be, like we previously discussed, potentially creating a new entity that solely is the manufacturing arm versus the distribution arm. And then you could look at the ownership play in that and how it could potentially benefit the owners. But I do know that a lot of the credits that we've looked at, there are criteria to be met, as Jamie had indicated. And a lot of it sometimes is tough. A lot of it sometimes doesn't make a lot of sense. But most of the time I do see that they do ask for the NAICS code that's reported on the tax return. So again, you'd have to consult with a tax professional on how to navigate that in terms of changing that NAICS code and or establishing a new manufacturing entity when you restructure to start doing operations here in the US. I don't know if anybody else has any takeaways on that. Tom, I don't know if you've gone through that process before of a company that is solely distribution that does bring manufacturing here, and the processes that have gone through to do that.
Yeah, I mean, we have, and they're both state and local. I haven't come across any federal benefits that we've had applied, but we generally make introductions to the companies, to the parties that can provide the additional incentives. And some countries, some states like New York actually has financial resources available to do training of people, new people for those jobs in the manufacturing. They'll give reductions on energy costs. We've seen that, and also help provide relief on the lease payments of locations and so forth. So there's really a significant amount of help, particularly in the New York market here. New Jersey is pretty good, and all the states that were mentioned in the discussion here all provide significant amount of relief. And we go nationally, so states like California, Arizona are examples of other states that very aggressively look to bring back manufacturing and have all kinds of financial incentives to make that happen. Going up the coast of California, both Oregon and Washington State have significant programs available. Utah has a huge manufacturing capability and a big program to bring back manufacturing. So there's a lot of opportunities out there. But in the local market here, I would say all the states that are in the mid-Atlantic all provide various incentives.
Yeah, and I do want to transition our conversation a little bit towards, I think we've done a lot of focus on reshoring, so I do want to come back to reshoring. But before I do that, maybe Jory, before we transition, we talked about 3PLs, we talked about build out companies here. What other considerations could be potentially applicable to both? And what have you seen? I know you've worked with a lot of companies over the years that have gone through this process. What have you seen from a digital perspective in creating that IT environment for them, whether it be a 3PL or your own business here, whether it be owned or leased?
Yeah, I mean, anytime you're seeing an organization go from being a distribution-centric company to manufacturing, a myriad of different considerations. Again, I defer to software functionality and capability to be able to support entirely new operations, right? So whether you're doing it 3PL and electing to go outsource and the economics make sense for you to do that, which we see a lot of organizations doing, or take it in-house. You've got to make sure that you have internal readiness to adapt the transformation from a distribution centric organization to one that can support bill of materials management, cost management, routings, and potentially some of the capabilities that you were using overseas production sources to do, you now have to take that on. So what does my supply chain look like domestically, right? What am I not capable of doing in-house, right? So maybe I can take on an assembly process or a manufacturing process, but what we're seeing a lot of is outsourced routing, right? Do I have finishing or anodizing or other, additional finishing processes that just not going to be able to take on internally? How does my software be able to adapt to that, and how does my infrastructure? And that's true whether that's a 3PL or that's true whether you're bringing it internally as well.
Yeah, thank you. I know we're coming up on almost 12:15. We do want to leave some time for questions if anybody has, but I do have one question for Tom before we get to that and open it up for everybody. Through your slide deck, you showed a slide of a lot of good alternative sourcing countries. But you did spend considerable time on Mexico in particular, with the Maquiladora. So my question for you is really how difficult would it be to get involved in Mexico sourcing and that Maquiladora manufacturing market, for any companies that are looking to bring? I know initially, Canada and Mexico were the first ones to kind of go through the wave of tariffs. So I think it might have made people a little skittish about using Mexico or whatnot. But in the conversations we've had, you still think it's a very viable alternative. And I know you, like I said, you spent considerable amount of time on it during your presentation. So my question is again, how difficult would it be to get involved in that type of program?
About 30% of the manufacturing in Mexico are contract manufacturers. So to access a contract manufacturer in Mexico that's in the Maquiladora program is as easy as going to China or Vietnam or South Korea or anywhere in the world to negotiate a deal. They're just as workable as any of these other places. But if you made a decision that you wanted to establish your own manufacturing location in Mexico, that you're looking at as a 9-month to 12-month project from beginning to end to go through the approval process to get the Mexican government to approve. And obviously, if you're buying an existing location, then you're ready to go after you make your adaptations. But if you're building a location, you've got the same amount of time, which you have to leave at least a year relative to building a new structure that's going to be a new manufacturing location. So you can turn on a contract manufacturer in a couple of weeks. If you're going to do it as your own physical location in any, that could take as much as a year. And you have a fair amount of costs locally. So you have to tie into a law firm locally to do your registrations and to handle the documentary needs from a legal perspective. And you need an accounting firm, which I know Citrin has a relationship there, that helps you navigate the accounting requirements, because there's requirements on the banking side that you use accountants for, of how the money is handled in and out of Mexico, and so forth. But we have boots on the ground in Mexico to support that whole effort. And the reason we focus on it is that when we evaluate at the end of the time period, a year, 2 years, 3 years, and in some cases now as much as 25 years, we find the greatest benefit that also combines sustainability and resilience in the supply chain comes from Mexico, as compared to other countries. So that's why we focus on it.
Makes sense. So Mark, did you have a question?
I was going to just say one of the other areas that I didn't mention that ought to be mentioned, I think applies to both, is concept of QC and compliance. Because as you start to take on these additional manufacturing steps in your processes, Very often, based upon industry, right, you may have to have mid-production QC evaluations performed. Is your 3PL going to be able to do that? How are they going to communicate that information? What kind of digital infrastructure do you have in place to capture that? And if you're doing that in-house, how are you going to capture that inline production content as well? So those are also considerations, not just inventory or cost accounting, but the subjectivity of that QC step as well.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you. Mark, did you have something?
Yeah, so we've answered a couple of the questions as they've come in. We have two more Q&A questions. I'll just kind of throw it out for now. Tom, I think this is more of a clarifying question back to one of your slides earlier about lead times and the analysis you did on using China versus bringing it back. Can you just expand on that? Because I think originally you said that the lead times were a little bit longer in the US, but then that kind of right sized as you got better at it. Can you walk us back through that?
Yeah, we found that when you did the comparison where you took somebody who's been buying in China and we moved that back to the United States, that there's a much longer lead time than in comparison to China. And that has to do with because there's a harder time trying to find a supplier in the United States that can supply that service and then gearing them up with the proper tools, equipment, and needs that they have in order to manufacture for you. And once you've established that, and now you're going to make a modification or a change or something like that, the lead time is the same as anywhere else. But the initial process just takes a little bit longer. And we find it that you can actually divide the country across the middle in half from east to west. And it's much more difficult north of the Mason-Dixon line as compared to south of the Mason-Dixon line. When country in states like Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, as examples, we can move things along much faster as compared to Wisconsin, Ohio, Michigan, in terms of moving things along.
Another question, Jory, this is really for you. You touched upon it earlier about using AI, but as companies are thinking about manufacturing, they're not using it. And I know in some of our surveys, we're seeing a higher utilization as companies are growing. What is kind of the best test case scenario you're seeing right now with manufacturing companies, either thinking about reshoring or just using AI in general?
Yeah, a couple of areas, obviously, especially with tariffs being an outsized influence today, I think the idea of optimizing inventory management, whether you're doing it within your own facilities, whether it's raw material or finished product, versus somebody on the outside maintaining that inventory for you. I think having the tools to perform predictive analysis using AI models is a huge factor, and your ability to execute in that regard will help enormously. Obviously, over the years, we've transitioned to a just-in-time inventory model, and you have complexities of supply chains with goods literally moving everywhere, all over the world. Being able to stay on top of that and using the power of these predictive models to look at demand trends, to look at supply trends, apply really intelligent algorithms to it, and making informed business decision, right? Then turning that into an actionable insight from a purchasing perspective or a production perspective is key. And we're seeing businesses, whether they're planning to move or not, leveraging AI in that area. I think that's kind of lower hanging fruit, not massive investments. I think there's lots of tools out there in the market that facilitates mid-market organizations' ability to execute there. So that's one tangible example as we think about inventory optimization, supply and demand planning, execution of key areas where businesses can be efficient.
And then last question from the Q&A so far, John, I'm not sure if any went directly to you.
I just have one wrap-up question, so go ahead.
Yeah, and Tom, I don't know if this is for you or for the group, but are there any kind of sub-industries that you're seeing more prevalent in considering reshoring than others?
I would say that the food industry, clothing, and consumer products are probably the three dominant areas that we see coming back now. And I'd say mainly because they're all the ones that are impacted by the tariff increases, that you see a higher rate of those companies looking for options and coming back. That would be it.
Okay, we're coming up on time, so are we going to questions, Mark? I have one final for the group. Yeah, good. Okay, so this is to wrap up. Before we go through this, I want to thank Tom again for joining us, Jamie and Jory for your time today. But I do want to get each of your thoughts on this final one, and it's really more of an opinion question. I just think it would be interesting to hear everybody's take. So we talk about reshoring and bringing activity back. So in your opinion, what policies do you think would be needed to make reshoring more attractive to everyone, to make companies really want to do it, and make it more prevalent? So I guess we'll start with Jory, then maybe we'll move to Jamie, and then we'll wrap with Tom.
Yeah, I mean, from a digital perspective, gosh, hard to say, if certain policies, not being a tax expert, and that's why I defer to everybody else in the forum here about that. Certainly recognizing that there's going to have to be some investment made, right, outside of the physical plant and physical equipment from a digital perspective. Most of what's taking place today is really going to be from a SaaS or cloud services perspective. Whether or not you can use more off-the-shelf solutions, certainly that keeps the cost and complexity down, versus building out or doing customizations, which may have some favorable, tax implications to doing that in terms of investment credits and things of that nature. Certainly policy that would be supportive of that. Where someone can take a legacy system, to Tom's earlier point, and not have to rip and replace it, but augment and customize and do so in a cost-effective way. And if there was some policy around being able to make those investments, and frankly, if they were to make policy changes that would enable an organization, if they were transitioning to something more modern and being, more efficient and go cloud-based, that is typically more of an OpEx as opposed to the CapEx investment of doing traditional customization, that would certainly be extremely favorable and enable organizations to get best of breed instead of a patchwork of older tech. So I think those are areas that I'd love to be able to see that.
Yeah. And how about you, Jamie? I know you're a little bit closer to it. So, what kind of policies do you see that would make it, more attractive to manufacture or bring businesses back here?
Sure. So, I mean, obviously there's the element of, additional incentives, right? And then potentially being able to lower tax rates or increase potential, depreciation deductions, accelerate them more, different business costs, right? Those are sort of the easy elements. My personal take is from a tax policy perspective, and I'll get into another area, but from a tax policy perspective, we are always taught, economics and law school sort of for looking for the sort of less impact from a tax perspective, meaning that the tax code should be designed ideally to not cause businesses to do one thing or not to do one thing, ideally. So potentially either you're going to put in more incentives and lower taxes and add additional deductions and credits, or taking apart the entire tax structure as a whole and looking at designing something that doesn't sort of pick winners and losers, right? But just kind of creates more sort of uniformity so that there's less behavioral reaction to the tax code and more business decisions being made based on factors that have nothing to do with tax. And then I think Tom mentioned earlier, right, the idea of, what I would call workforce development, right? We've got a major problem in this country that we can bring all the jobs back and production back, but we don't necessarily have the workforce for filling those jobs, and they don't have the necessary skill sets for a host of different reasons we can get into in terms of being able, again, to fill those positions and have the requisite skill sets. So the more we can do sort of in the way of additional training, apprenticeship programs, maybe even quite frankly, a PR campaign at the educational levels of that, these types of jobs are not necessarily bad things, can be glorified, are sources of great income, can lead to generational wealth. There's opportunities here as opposed to, I think, some of the historical sort of attitudes towards, you know, manufacturing and production jobs, especially over the last few decades. So I think it's sort of a multi-level issue that hopefully, I think, like I said, tax policy ideally isn't driving it, but more so maybe getting the right workers in with the right skills and getting in at this problem at an early stage so that kids are getting these skills and these practical training at, you know, an earlier age.
Thanks. Tom, final thoughts?
You know, Trump is creating decentives for companies to reshore by putting tariffs in place. And at the end of the day, the consumer is the one who's going to pay that price in the short term. In the long term, it might have a turnaround benefit. I think that the federal government can give incentives, particularly tax incentives for companies that bring manufacturing back to the United States, and also to develop foreign companies from bringing their manufacturing locations to the United States. So it'll all be done through tax incentives. Second is the workforce programs. I think there's a very successful program now in Suffolk County. A lot of the businesses through what's called the Long Island Consortium, Ignite, surveyed all the companies that wanted to expand their manufacturing. There's about 300 companies in Suffolk County that manufacture, and they found the problem with you know, high skilled blue collar labor. So with Stony Brook University, Suffolk Community College, they developed a workforce program funded by both federal monies and New York State monies. And they have a program where they combine getting a bachelor's degree with a blue collar technical knowledge of how to, you know, get involved with actual manufacturing prowess. And that program is working. It's actually very successful. And I think that needs to be done on a much larger scale. And I know other parts of the country are doing these micro programs, but I think it has to be brought out to a much greater scale. And the last point I want to make is that while I'm in full support of the concept of reshoring and risk management, supply chain diversification, I think that Trump should be more focused on identifying specific products and commodities that we want to manufacture here or bring back manufacturing. Because if they want to continue to make clothing in China and toys in China and low-end industrial products, they should be allowed to do it because they do it well, they do it at low cost, produce a quality product. We want to focus in the pharma industry, the medical products industry, automobile, aviation, high technology. You know, I think that's where the government should be focused on, is bringing back those industries. I don't necessarily need a hanger manufacturer that's in, Shanghai, China, to move manufacturing for hangers here in the United States. That should stay outside of our country. So those would be my closing comments.
Okay. Well, we're coming up on 12:30. So once again, I want to thank Tom for his presentation and participation on this panel, as well as Jamie Reichard, our SALT partner here at Citrin Cooperman, and Jory Weissman, a key partner in our digital services team. Myself, John Giordano, co-leader of manufacturing distribution with Mark Henry. I want to wish everybody a great rest of your day. Thanks again.